Hi, everybody. Welcome to Insomniacs in episode 5. My name is Mitchell. We've got Misha and Cliff, our host, with us today. And today we're going to jump into the world of sake. We've got some amazing guests on today. We're going to start off with John Wartner. He is one of the leading sake professionals in the world. We've got Tamiko Ishidate with Young's Market as the director of sake, and then Monica Samuels for the director with Vine Connection Imports. So welcome, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
My pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
John, you have quite the background, certifications and everything. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your certifications, where you live? I know you're split between two worlds. Jump in it.
Right. I'll try and keep it relatively short because it could go on forever. But I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio. I lived in Ohio most of my life. And in '88, I decided to take a break from life. And I went to Japan to teach English. Soon after arriving there, I got into sake, and I got more into sake. I got way into sake. And pretty much became my motivation for studying the language and doing a lot of other things. Originally an engineer, I was doing that work for a while as well, but slowly I got into the sake world and I started writing for the newspaper there. That led to a book, which led to another book, which led to an internet site. I got more and more involved in the industry. That eventually led to hooking up with Vine Connections to export sake to them. And then as I was doing seminars for foreigners living in Tokyo, I realized, and also through working with Vine Connections, that the key to making sake more popular around the world was the industry understanding it. If you got a catalog of 10,000 wines and 20 sake that you can't pronounce, you're not going to try and sell the sake. And that's the bottleneck. So I took a bunch of seminars that I had been doing and put them together and developed a course for professionals. And so I've been doing that for about 18 years now. And I continue to write and continue to speak, and all of it just kind of piled into being a career and a half, all focused around sake.
Impressive.
I could go on and on if you want me to, but that's the short version.
That's awesome. We just want to get you guys a little introduction. Monica Samuels coming from New York, correct? Hold on, Monica. You're muted currently.
Oh, sorry about that. I am from New York. I'm originally from Southern California. I've been in New York for 16 years now. I am the director of sake and spirits for Vine Connection. So I work with both John and Tamiko very closely. I've been working with sake for the entire 16 years that I've lived in New York now. I started out in the restaurant industry. I'm half Japanese, and being able to speak a little Japanese helped me get a lot of jobs in different restaurants that I was probably unqualified for, but since I could talk to the chef, I ended up working in some pretty cool places and fell in love with sake. And thanks to people like John, who made sake accessible and sake education accessible to people living outside of Japan, I had a lot of opportunities to learn and spent a lot of time in Japan. My grandfather actually worked in a sake brewery after he was discharged from World War II. So it's something that's been in my family for a long time. And I worked for a large distributor as their sake director for many years. And I've been with Vine Connections for almost 6.5 years now.
That's awesome. Monica, we loved having you on our Insomniacs blind tasting the other day with Cliff. Going over to Tamiko, huge fan of yours, obviously. We've been friends for a while. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. I mean, first of all, I feel like I should be on the side of the screen, not in the middle. I mean, I'm surrounded by my mentors and amazing individuals with so much credentials and respect. So I'm honored to be included in this. My name is Tamiko Ishidate. I'm originally from Chiba, Japan. I am big time, like how do you call it? Kaseki, like the fossil now. I've lived in the US a lot longer than I have grown up in Japan, but I have kept my love and the respect for my culture and country through my work. That's been such blessing. Let's see, I really started getting really into sake about 17 years ago, 17, 18. Until then, I was just like normal Japanese women grew up in the 80s, you know, drinking cocktails, sweet cocktails, and cheap wines and the beer, and that was our thing. But I have kind of come to rediscover and appreciate our national beverage, the sake, deeply. And the more I learn, I realize that, oh my gosh, there's so much to it. And I'm still, learning every day. And I have learned so much from Monica. And then, of course, John. It's been amazing since I took his, John, remember 2009, 8, maybe I took your class in New York. Yeah,
New York, right? Same one Monica was in. You guys were both there. I don't know if you guys remember that.
That's right. That was the first time I met you, Monica. That's right. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I can't believe that's 12 years ago. It's been an amazing journey. I'm absolutely passionate about sake, but also my specialty is kind of more into the food and sake pairing. It's a lot of fun. Yeah, so now I'm with the Young's Market 8 years now, and I've worked with you guys. Yes. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Tamiko. It's been great working with you. I love Japanese food. I think I incorporate into my meals at least 2-3 times a week if I can. Wish it would be more now, especially since we can't get out as much as we want. John, can you speak to just the different styles? There's a whole range that maybe you see in a grocery store or maybe you see in restaurants that people would want to know about.
When you say styles, I assume you mean grades?
Yeah. You
If
tell
we
us.
start talking about styles, I mean, there's no clear delineation, so you can go on forever and ever about styles. Considering the medium that we're broadcasting on here, if I were to try and make this something that's digestible to people watching this kind of a medium, I guess I would divide sake in a couple of ways. And the first thing I would say is that when you look at the various grades of sake, they're pretty much defined by how much you mill the rice. And in short, and again, this is an oversimplification, but the more you mill the rice, the better the sake is going to be. It's not quite that simple, but if you're trying to convey it quickly, it is. And the reason is that proper sake rice in particular has more fat and protein, which you don't want on the outside of the rice, and starch, which you do want on the inside. So the more you mill the rice, the more you're taking away the fat and protein, leaving only the starch behind, which will give you a cleaner, more elegant, more refined product. So the grades of sake are defined by legally nothing more significant than how much you've milled the rice before you begin to brew. A quick caveat is that it's never that simple. Don't pay attention to just the milling of the rice. There's a million other things that affect the quality of sake, but the legal grades are defined by pretty much that. The next thing I would talk about is the use of pure distilled alcohol in the brewing process or the lack thereof. If the word junmai is somewhere on the label, and there's several manifestations of that, junmai ginjo, junmai daiginjo, but if the word junmai is on the label somewhere, that means it was made with rice, water, and something called koji, which is moldy rice only. If the word junmai is not there, they've added a bit of distilled alcohol. And when they do that in premium sake, they add a bit of distilled alcohol to pull out more flavor and aroma. So the junmai types and the non-junmai types, neither is better than the other. They're just slightly different. Junmai is richer. The added alcohol types, like this daiginjo, tend to be a little bit lighter. But you can pretty much divide all sake into either the junmai styles and the non-junmai styles. So you've got that classification as well as the milling. The more they mill it, the better it's going to be. And if it's a junmai, it's going to be a bit richer. If you wanted to remember one word about sake, and I hesitate to say this, but I kind of have to, remember the word ginjo. Ginjo is like super premium sake. It's basically the top 15% of all sake. It's made with highly milled rice. It's more refined. It's generally more aromatic. If you want to remember only one word, let that word be ginjo. Because if you're drinking something with the word ginjo somewhere embedded on the label, you're going to walk away satisfied. You're going to walk away impressed, and you're going to come back for more sake. If you want to remember one more word, let it be daiginjo. And remember that daiginjo is ginjo to die for. That's all I'm going to have to say about that. And one more caveat. If you limited yourself to only ginjo, you'd be ripping yourself off, depriving yourself of so much great sake. So that ginjo crutch is a great way to get started, but you're going to have to get off the crutches and walk and then run into the sake world soon after that. That's as concise as I could get, and I think it's appropriate considering the medium we're using. How is that?
That's awesome, John. Thank you.
Stuff in your back pocket and go to the restaurant or go to the store and walk away with sake.
That's perfect. I know Cliff had a question for Monica just about sake and sales. So Cliff, have at it.
Yeah, so yeah, I feel a bit like Luke Skywalker here, speaking to the Yodai, the Jedi's here. So tables are turned on me. But Monica, question for you. So I could, we've worked together quite a few times, and I've seen sales in California of sake increase year after year, and I presume that's a similar trend across the USA. What would you account that for?
Well, I think first and foremost, we're very grateful and indebted to the popularity of sushi in the U.S. over the last 20 years. And I think that that's built in an opportunity for people to say, oh, it would be fun to have some sake with sushi. And so it's something that everyone has heard of at this point. But what's really been impressive is in the last 10 years, where the understanding of Japanese cuisine has broadened so much more beyond sushi. And the average consumer finally seems to understand that sake is not just one taste and one flavor, where I think a lot of people are comparing sake to vodka, like, oh, I like it or I don't like it. And if you say, I don't like wine, you would probably say, well, you haven't had the right one. Where most people will still say, well, yes, sake, it's not really for me. I've tried it before. It's not really my thing. And so I think that the understanding of the universe of both Japanese food and the spectrum of sake has broadened quite a bit. I think that there are several reasons that people do decide to drink sake. One of them is certainly a lifestyle choice. We see huge increases in sake in places that don't have a lot of Japanese people living there and don't have a particularly authentic Japanese food scene. But I think that the demographic of people who are open to trying sake are generally more educated, more experimental, more affluent. And so we're seeing a lot of cities like Denver, Colorado, and Chicago and Boston that don't necessarily have huge Japanese populations, but these people are looking for a different experience. So I would say that those are some attributes. And I think that it's also very chef driven in a bigger way. I think that no matter what cuisine you're looking at, fermentation is becoming a much more important part of every cuisine. And that really challenges a lot of classic wine pairings. And even something that's been around as long as beef tartare is actually really hard to pair with wine, right? If you think about Worcestershire and mustard and cornichons and kind of the funk of aged beef, that becomes extremely challenging. And so I think that more chefs have understood as the understanding of umami has just expanded across every cuisine. I think that it's been very chef driven at the very high level where we see sake paired on tasting menus. And I think that the consumer also is just understanding how versatile sake is. You can leave, for a retail consumer, you can leave a bottle open for so much longer than a bottle of wine. You can watch the same sake evolve drastically if you're pairing it with something spicy versus a vinegary dish or just on its own. And so I think that spectrum of different opportunities to drink sake and the fact that sake is not as precious as people initially thought is really helping its growth.
That's great. I remember, years ago, going way back, it was just hot sake that gave you a hangover the next day. And those days are far behind us now. So, John, I got a question for you. So, two questions really is, what's the sake scene in Japan like now? I remember hearing years ago that the younger generation weren't drinking as much, or it was losing a bit of its sort of style, so to speak. Where is that headed now?
Well, the first thing to point out is that actually overall alcohol consumption, basically everything is dropping in Japan. Not massively, but a little bit. Sake continues to drop. It's actually less than 7% of all alcoholic beverages consumed these days. However, if you look at the sake market, about 60 to 65% of it now is Futsusu, or non-premium sake. And again, I got to be careful with that word because a lot of Futsusu is just really, really, really enjoyable. It's just not officially ranked as a premium sake. And that's been contracting pretty quickly. However, if you look at premium sake, like the Four Ginjo types and Junmaishu, that's growing steadily. But if you've got 30% of the market to 35% of the market growing at 0 to 10% a year, and 65% of the market dropping at 7 to 10% of the year, the entire market's going to continue to contract. So it is doing that. Having said that, there's definitely a shift towards premium. There has been an increase in popularity in the sake in the past 3 to 5 years, I'd say. Just tons of events for young people, events for old people, events for women, events for men, just events for small brewers, big brewers, all kinds of sake events all over. So sake is getting a lot more media attention, a lot more attention in the younger population. High school students, college students, not yet. That'll take a while.
That kind of leads into my next question, John.
Popularity. Say that again?
That kind of leads into my next question. Monica talked about kind of sommeliers and chefs, but how would you characterize in America, for example, the typical sake drinker now? What's the age that's or the style of generation that's driving the sales?
In the United States?
Yeah.
Certainly people that enjoy wine and enjoy food are the first ones to flock to sake. Again, Monica and Tamiko could speak to that a lot more with a lot more experience than I do, but a quick backup to this is, to me, one of the biggest effects in making sake more popular is wine somms. I mean, I think until about 10 years ago, they just snickered at sake and didn't take it seriously. But all of a sudden they had to learn it for tests, right? And because they bought it to study and pay attention, they're like, whoa, this stuff's actually pretty good. And they learn about it and they're genuinely interested. And if a somm walks to the table and says, look, I know you usually have this wine with this, but I got this great sake, it's just gonna click with this dish, no one's gonna say no. They're gonna go with it. So my point is twofold here, that somms have really helped sake popularity. Furthermore, the places where somms are to be found is where sake is really popular these days.
That's
Again,
true.
I think Monica and Tamiko can both speak to that more effectively than I can. But to me, that's a big change I've seen over the last 15 years or so.
So I just did the advanced sommelier exam, and there was a few sake questions on, and they were much harder than when I've done it previously. I can't quite remember them, but you had to know your stuff to answer these questions. So I'm gonna hand it over to Mitchell.
Yeah, I mean, John, you kind of really led that straight up to what I really want to talk to Tamiko about, to kind of bring up to everybody. I mean, on the front lines here in California, us trying to get restaurants that aren't specifically Asian-inspired restaurants to bring sake onto their list, either by the glass or by the bottle. What are some of the big things that you think are just some of the major kind of points of bringing it in for these somms to really look at it? If that makes sense.
Who is that addressed to?
That was to Tamiko.
Well,
Yeah, but I'm gonna write on John's comment earlier first. So I think that trend, John-san, do you remember, I think, was it even as recently as 5 or 6 years ago, the Futsusu ratio was about 70, it was more like 75, right? It's not that long ago.
you're correct. Yes, 100% correct.
Yeah.
It's dropping every year. It's between 60 and 65 now, but you're right. It was like 75 just, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. And even though those, premium jizake type, premium sake is up, like a ginjo sake is up, you're only talking about 5%. And that, to your point, the 65% contracting. And so in terms of who is supporting in terms of age group and consumers of sake, I think there are definitely roughly 2 types, I think, and it's same thing can be said about in Japan. One is kind of more older, established, like my dad, who would only drink packed sake, or maybe at the best it would be a very inexpensive Junmai, Honjozo, and Nishobi. He would nurse it, right? And then there is a newer sake consumers, younger generation, I don't know which generation will start, but maybe I would say those in there, a tail end of Generation X and, and then younger, who are really embracing jizake or the artisan small production sakes. And in America, it's kind of similar, but a little bit different. One is, I think there is a mass, sorry, I gotta plug in the power cord. Sorry. I think there is this kind of an old school consumers who are those who Clifford Point was drinking hot sakes, and 15 years ago, and now starting to really shift their gears to premium sake, but still somewhat large brand driven, a more traditional, kind of similar to, a boomer's approach to wine, right? It's a younger generation who's drinking esoteric, the orange wines or biodynamics or, the small producer stuff is more driven by younger as opposed to boomers or Generation X older, Generation X. So I think it's a little bit similar in sake. And where I feel like in America, the SOMs can really affect is very interesting because they, depending on concept and the price point in the restaurants, it can affect both worlds. But in the, at the economic, socioeconomic population thereafter, by introducing sort of like the new way to appreciate premium sake through non-traditional pairing concept to the older traditional drinkers, and that also at the same time really like continue to help fuel these younger generations exploration of new stuff that includes sake and include non-traditional sort of the context where sake can be enjoyed. So that is kind of their, I see, if that's what you're asking, where they can contribute to the, to sake industry or the growth of thereof.
Yeah, as when we're out in the field talking to these different SOMs or maybe restaurant buyers that aren't SOMs, it's just what are some of the best kind of sales pitches basically to get them in? That was kind of, I guess, like what your practices are that you've been utilizing.
I think she might not have heard you, Mitch.
Tamiko?
That's pretty much an indication she can't hear you.
All good. Let's switch bases real quick.
Yeah, I'll switch. So kind of in that though, with service and everything, Monica, I got a chance to meet you a couple months ago now. We worked on, you ran through some different tastings with me, and something that we didn't really get to touch is glassware. Beer, wine, there's so many different glasswares that you use with totally different styles. Is sake kind of the same way? Different grades of sake, different glassware, and different, basically vessels for consumption?
Oh, totally. And I did a super geeky sake dinner once where we served the exact same sake for 5 courses, but we would just keep switching the type of vessel or the temperature the sake was served at. And it totally changed, and people were blown away because it doesn't sound, it sounds like you feel like you got hoodwinked when you show up to sake dinner and you realize you're only going to get to taste one sake. But then when you see the evolution, it's really incredible. And so there's not, a lot of companies have tried to come up with the ultimate sake glass, which is kind of a gimmicky thing if you think about sake, because, John talked about ginjo earlier, and when I think about ginjo, I'm thinking about ginjo aromas, and those types of really concentrated tropical fruit floral aromas, they blossom so beautifully in a wine glass or something with a larger mouth. Like I'm using a champagne glass right now that's bigger than a flute, and I'm drinking a ginjo, and it's beautiful. But if you drink it out of a ceramic small cup, you might miss some of the aroma. Where conversely, if you're having a sake that's high acid, high umami, that's really meant, it's meant about the flavor and the finish and the body and the persistence, that is probably not as, doesn't benefit as much from being in a wine glass. And so I think you can really play around, and sometimes you want to close certain aromas to accommodate different dishes, and sometimes you want to open them up. And so it's really fun. And I love, like, one of my favorite drinking cultures in Japan is when you go to a restaurant and they let you choose what you're going to drink your sake out of based on what you ordered. I think I also love when they keep changing your glassware based on the sake, but it's nice to be able to have that option to see how a sake will benefit from a bigger cup versus a smaller cup, etc.
Totally. So, you mentioned kind of stemware flutes. With champagne, flutes are great for getting the aromatics straight up. I'm assuming sake has got some of those same kind of qualities, where sometimes you just want them straight up into your nose versus some that you definitely want the aromatics to just flow through.
Yeah, I would say that some of the aromatic sake aromatics are generally, they can get a little, they can evaporate a little bit in too big of a glass, and so sometimes you do want that straight up for a very if you want to experience all of the different layers of a ginjo aromatic complexity, but sometimes the bigger, fuller, more generous, richer styles can handle, like I really like a glass like this, that's just big and flat for more of a rustic style of sake, because I think if the sake is sturdy enough to accommodate this much surface area, it's very different from having a ginjo and a more straight up kind of glass.
That's awesome. I could geek out with you about the glassware because it's so cool to see the different kind of wines, beer, and sake, that could be poured that way. I'll turn it over to Misha though at this point. That way I don't geek out too much on it.
Hey, Tamiko, are you back? Can you hear us?
I'm back. I can hear.
Awesome.
I can
Cool.
hear. Technical difficulty.
I was afraid we lost you for good.
All
Cool.
Sorry about
Hey, I
that.
had a question. So I'm a big beer geek, studying for my certified Cicerone, and yeah, glassware was a huge component. I have a lot of glassware myself. You have tulips, you have, just like you said, Monica, things that constrict the nose or tighten the aromas like a champagne flute, or things that open up like a Belgian beer. Tamiko, are there any crossovers? Like, say you were a big IPA guy. Like, there's a lot of beer drinkers out there right now that love IPA, that's more aromatic and citrusy. Is there a crossover that you ever see? I'm an IPA guy. What kind of sake would you like? Or let's say I like brown ales or stouts, and what kind of, how do we get a crossover community? Because I don't make any money off of beer. I just enjoy drinking it. But I'd love if other people who enjoy drinking beer could cross over to sake, because that's where we make our money.
Wow, that's a loaded question. I mean, I'm sure everyone, and Monica, I'm sure you have your thoughts, and Johnson, you do too. It's that kind of sort of like correlating to another beverage is always a little bit tricky, because you don't want to stereotype or kind of compartmentalize. Yeah, Johnson, you want to add to that now?
Well, I can take it when you're done. When you're done.
Okay. For example, one of our customers in San Francisco, True Sake, it's a dedicated sake retail store, the first one in America, very passionate owner, Bo Timken. I think, as far as I know, he might have been even the very first one started that in terms of consistently the labeling in his shelf toppers, the equivalent in wine and beer. So, for example, he would have some nice juice, but with good, aromatic, but it has kind of nice body and a little bit of, the acidity, a little bit of bone, to it. Like he may say, like, I would equate this to aromatic, ale, or like silky red, or, he actually, on his shelf docker, he correlates to those two beverage types. One is beer, one is wine. It's actually, I have asked, if that really, what he hears as far as if it helps the consumers. And his answer, the fact that he's still doing it today after 13 years or 14 years having a store, it actually does seem to help the new consumers who just don't know where to start. So when you are like, to your point, Michelle, like I'm a, pale ale drinker, and I occasionally have a glass of like Pinot Noir, like that may give us somewhat of a starting point as to the world of sake. Although, again, it's just a starting point, and you have to explore your palate almost as if it's a brand new, starting from scratch, because, again, I don't think those correlations are always accurate or works, because sake is so nuanced and so can be subtle, and differences can be subtle. And yeah, and I'm sure Johnson or any comments on that further.
Yeah, so just to comment on that real quick, for me, when I started out drinking sake, I always thought of it more like unoaked white wine. So you had, let's say, Pinot Blanc on one spectrum, or Pinot Gris, and then all the way to maybe Sauvignon Blanc. So you had the citrusy aromatics on one end, and this crispness, and then maybe that's your Junmai Daiginjo. Your very aromatic Sauvignon Blanc that's fresh. But Yeah, I always thought it was a much tighter range, and I've been learning, with Yamaha and all these other styles that the range can expand. But I thought initially it was almost like, if I'm a Pinot Grigio drinker, what's the difference between Pinot Grigio, Pinot Gris, and Pinot Blanc? Like, it was very narrow to me, and that's what I'm trying to expand, like identifying the different acidities and aromatics and umamis, etc. But John, you had some comments about that.
Well, the main point I would make is that unfortunately, sake refuses to cooperate. In other words, sake refuses to be fit into one mold. You can't force it into a framework. So, for example, we look at Yamaha, usually very gamey, right? Very wild, higher acidity, higher sweetness, usually. But you're going to have Yamaha out there that are just, if I didn't tell you it was a Yamaha, you wouldn't know. So, for example, if we said, all right, you like IPAs, go for a Yamaha. And then they buy some Yamaha that's a subtle Yamaha, right? And they taste it, has nothing to do with an IPA, right? Boom, you lost that one. Or for example, if you like Pilsners, go for a Niigata Daiginjo because it's going to be subtle. It's not going to be so big and so bold. When they taste it, it's got all this small. It's got all this fruit. I'm like, this has nothing to do with Saz hops. It's nothing to do with the subtlety of a Pilsner. So to a certain degree, the generalizations will work, but they're pretty limited because, to me, one of the most interesting things about sake is that as soon as you think you figured it out, it mutates. The sake doesn't mutate. The point is you'll find exceptions to the rules that you thought you had just laid down. So in trying to pair with beers, you can do it, but really usefulness is not very deep in my mind. It's good to start with, but you're going to run into exceptions about 10 minutes down the road. That's the fun.
I think we all like beer, so we all have some strong opinions here. Misha, I am totally in your camp that I really want to capture that beer drinker. I think what's really interesting about the beer drinker is that the average beer drinker is so much more geeky than the average wine drinker. And if you talk to someone walking into a wine bar and they're like, what kind of wine do you like? If they're not in the industry, you're probably not going to be that impressed by their response, right? They're like, well, I don't know. I kind of like Sauvignon Blanc. I like fruity. And then you ask a beer drinker who's gone to a craft beer bar what kind of beer they want. And they're not just going to say IPA. They're going to say that they want a New England style IPA in the style of this producer. And the beer drinkers, they ask all these questions about the BTUs and the pressure of like what kind of gas blends being used and the temperature that the beer is dispensed at. And so I think it's easier to get beer drinkers to appreciate sake because it's a lot more about the skill of the producer and the decisions made in production. And it's so much about the water. And I totally agree with John and Tamiko. We can't make generalizations. I always try to. I have a craft beer versus sake pairing wheel. But one thing that I've seen accounts do that's really cool is when they have a very robust beer program to do a sidecar sake, not like a sake bomb, but like a great example is like a goze beer that has a really nice saltiness with a sake that has a lot of salinity. And so just having people taste a sake in that very different narrative, thinking about it in the context of a beer where the style of the beer is something they already understand, makes that sake so much more approachable to them. And I think that there are these malty qualities in sake that kind of mimic a lot of malty qualities in beer. And so, I mean, I know that in a lot of casual restaurants, I like to start with a beer and then phase into sake, or order a large beer for two people and maybe a carafe of sake and drink them side by side. And I think that textural juxtaposition is really fun. And I think you can discover different notes in the beer and the sake, tasting them side by side. So I think there's definitely an opportunity there. We just have to frame it the right way.
Yeah. Monica, you kind of stole that from me. I mean, in wine, when you're, serving or whatnot, you normally are asking people, what do you normally drink? Like Misha was saying, I'm either drinking Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Grigio, or whatever. And you can kind of gauge off flavors, a recommendation for them. But to John's point, if there's not really any set guidelines, you're really kind of wild westing it until you get a flavor profile, it sounds like. Is that ultimately correct, you think?
100%.
Cliff, sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
Monica, exactly what you said. So my thought on beer drinkers these days, and I'm glad I'm not in the beer business because it's so impossible to have any loyalty right now. But beer drinkers walk in and they go, "What's new on your tap?" You know, they always want something new. And maybe as a som or a bartender, you can guide them to go, "Okay, you can ask those questions. You like an IPA? Let's look at our options." But beer drinkers are truly going online, they're looking for new styles, they're researching brewers, they're looking at ingredients. That's so much more relatable to a sake brewer, which is very interesting for us, for sure. So I think as wine professionals, we're trying to relate to that and understand how to talk to that clientele. Cliff, I believe you had a question.
Yeah, I was just going to change the pace a little bit. So Monica, a question I have for you. There's a lot of culture, tradition, and history in drinking sake. So I remember, you know, one, for example, where you shouldn't pour your own. You know, I would be pouring. Can you sort of talk to some of the traditions and where they come from, what they mean? You know, the overflowing, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's kind of important to understand that the history of premium sake is pretty short in Japan. Sake has been around for hundreds of years, but it was so much about ceremony and kind of hospitality and seasonality and drinking sake in certain times of year, certain occasions. And it can be very poetic, you know, drinking sake, looking at the first snowfall. Right now, if we weren't all stuck at home, we'd be drinking sake and looking at cherry blossoms. We'd be but premium sake, people say that premium sake was first commercially distributed in the 1991 in Japan, right? And I think it was in the 80s that people were kind of rushing around to create all these Junmai Ginjo, Daiginjo categories. And so it wasn't until quite recently that people realized that we should drink sake, not just because this is the time to drink sake, but because it's delicious and it actually goes really well with food. So that, I think the custom of pouring for each other is super important in Japan. And it's kind of this whole concept of, like, I don't know how to say like kizukai in English, but it's just kind of paying attention to the other person and making sure that they have what they need. So even if you're like serving them food and putting it on their plate and making sure their glass is full, that kind of being very conscious of the other person's needs is a very big part of culture in Japan. And then the overflowing is this term of Omoterashi, which is kind of like unending hospitality. Like, we're not, you know, we're here to, there's an abundance of how we want to serve and treat you well, which are really important concepts in Japanese culture. But overflowing someone's cup doesn't make the sake taste better, you know, and the sake doesn't necessarily, so it's more, these are not designed to enhance the flavor of the sake. It's more Japanese custom.
Is it true that if you bought the bottle of sake and I poured it and overflowed your cup with your own sake, that's kind of rude? Or not done? Taboo?
I never heard that.
Oh, should we leave that one alone?
Actually, I would augment that by saying that the overflowing thing usually happens at restaurants. If you're drinking with somebody at home, you don't overflow their glass. It's just a mess. Put it in a restaurant, overflow your glass into a dish or a bowl or a masu, which I just happen to have right here, right? They might do that. The point is, at home, people don't do that for each other.
Yeah.
You know.
So, John, I got a question for you as well that I had a lot of trouble learning.
Question for you, Cliff. I need more sake.
All right, here we go. So my question for you, I think I need some too.
Remember, Rio, California time, Clifford.
All right, round robin.
Serving temperatures of sake from it's like skin warm to there's water, you know, bath warm. Briefly, if you could just sort of, you know, it's very specific, even more so than wine temperatures, I believe.
It's ridiculous too. I think I jumped the gun. I mean, I think somebody somewhere found this chest with this old chart of all the temperatures, the names for them. It said, blew off the dust and said, "Oh, let's promote this." Nobody talks like that. There's maybe three, you know, Atsukan, Nurukan, Jon, Hiya. That's four, but not 10 or anything like
Yeah.
that.
Okay.
So in terms of the terminology, there's a couple. There's not, and nobody in the world uses those 10. You guys agree? Maraka and Tamiko, you agree with that? Yeah, nobody uses that kind of stuff.
So basically, we
there's
could
a
say,
few,
no, John, I say basically we could say it's chilled from the fridge, room temperature, or warm.
well, really, honestly, there's everything in between, right? But you don't have names for everyone, and what you don't have is very specific temperatures at which any particular sake is going to be its best. It doesn't work that way. It's what you like. So yeah, certain flavor profiles, like if something's got a good amount of sweetness or a good amount of earthiness, it'll be better off closer to room temperature. A higher acidity might be better off warmer because it'll spread everything out. Other people might have different opinions with this. If something that's aromatic, you warm it up, you're just going to bludgeon that out of existence, right? There's certain principles and rules that will apply to sake in general and things like that. But when it gets down to the specifics, you take one temperature that's, let's say you start with a sake at white wine temperature. Any sake is just going to be too subdued right out of the fridge. And then you're sipping that, 15 minutes later, it's closer to room temperature. And one of the 4 people drinking it says, wow, I like it better this way. And another person may say, man, not really. But certainly the flavor would open up, right? The aromas will open up or close up as you go from white wine temperature to room temperature. And then somebody might say, hey, let's warm this up a bit. Let's just nuke that for 30 seconds, see what happens. And a couple of people might love it and others might not. But it'll also depend on what the sake is. So you've got, half a dozen dynamics happening at once.
No, that's right. I get that. So, no, good answer. Yeah. So, Mitchell, let me pass over to you.
Yeah. So, yeah, the hand. John, you've been, just from our conversation this far, your wealth of knowledge. You've been studying, and you said you moved to Japan in 1988.
Yeah.
Do you teach classes here in the U.S., California specifically? For people that are really trying to get into sake, what is the best way to get educated?
Oh, you asked the right person.
I do educational programs, and when I work with Vine Connections, I'll do 1-hour seminars, right? Aside from my work with VC, I also do a series of 3-day courses, sake professional course, that's very, very intense and focused. And really, it's basically 3 days in a row. We'll lecture for 2 hours, taste, lecture for 2 hours, taste, lecture for 2 hours, taste. And you'll taste upwards between 80 and 90 sake over the 3 days. And there is a certification exam after that. So I do those courses usually 3 times a year in the US and once in Japan. And then there's an advanced level I do in Japan only as well. So yeah, I do a lot of education programs like that, but those aren't necessarily the most accessible thing to everybody. There's a lot of stuff on the internet, but I would say this, probably the best way to learn about sake is to taste as wide a variety as you can. Drink it. And I know that sounds like I'm being facetious, but it's the truth. Buy something somewhere. Buy another bottle. Compare them. That's the best education you get. The ginjo, the seimai buai, the acidity, all that, you can get it off the internet. You can get it off that YouTube. Seriously. And those are often very good and enough of an education. And I would love to promote my courses. They're great. I love them. Please come. But at the same time, the most important thing you can do is buy sake and taste it. It doesn't have to be the best. On top of that, what you should do as wide a range as possible. See what you like, see what you don't like. If you know that much, you're done.
That's fair.
All right. So I think Misha and I are going to tag team here at a little on blind tasting, because Monica, we did a blind tasting the other day, a lot of fun, and then you turned the table on me with this one. Hey, John.
Yeah.
Are you up to the challenge? I do a little at the Mad Song, a blind tasting.
Take some notes.
No, we're not going to do it now. You come on the virtual, the live one.
Yeah, sure, of course. I'd be happy to do that.
All right. You heard it here. It's coming on. Right? And then Misha, I know you had a question.
Yeah, John. So we chatted briefly earlier. I think I'm pretty good at wine blind tasting, and I've certainly had, just for my certified cicerone, I had to have a stout next to a porter, and I would try, like you said, you buy a lot, right? You try 30 of them next to each other, and you identify the slight differences and what you liked, and maybe think about stylistically how that happened in the brewing process or the aging process, whatever. Can you give me, as someone I genuinely like sake, but for some reason, and it's probably just out of practice, you know, I haven't been in the field as much as I should be pouring sake. Can you give me some basics if I'm trying to increase my blind tasting skills for sake, how to identify it? Because I feel like when I go into wine, I'm thinking alcohol, that's a big indicator of New World, Old World. I'm thinking acidity, Old World, New World. There's all these really clear indicators in wine. But what in sake are those, like Cliff and I talk about, there's maybe 4 basic things. Is it overtly floral right off the bat? So we all of a sudden start going this direction with Gewürztraminer, Riesling, Moscato, whatever, Viognier. What in sake, if there's some tidbits, and obviously I need to do a lot more studying, and I'm looking forward to my WSET 3 later, but anything you can share would be very helpful.
So I am assuming, based on what you just told me, that you're not necessarily looking for finding something you like or describing it well, but rather blind tasting. What do I have in front of me? Is it a Daiginjo or is it a Yamahai, that kind of thing, right?
Identification.
Yeah. Well, again, the caveat or the thing that I questioned you about before applies. In other words, for any style, not every sake in the industry is going to fit the mold for that style, right? So let's shorten this by saying, let's assume that whatever you're giving it a blind tasting for an exam or something like that is going to be a typical manifestation of the style that we're talking about, right? So for example, if you look at Daiginjo, usually it's very fruity and aromatic. Banana, melon, apple, things like that, right? But there are certain regions and certain producers that just don't like that fruity stuff, so they don't make it that way. But it'll still be really, really refined. So another thing, as I mentioned before about Yamahai, it's not always going to fit the mold. But there's a couple of things I would say. One is when you taste a sake, always take notes. Always, always, always take notes. If you do that, you crystallize your thinking about it, right? And you've learned to express what it is you're tasting. And that is huge in learning to remember flavor profiles. That's one thing I would recommend. The other is to taste as wide a range as possible of flavor profiles that are out there. I know that sounds oversimple, so I'll give you something even more complicated. There's a really great exercise, and I'm going to honestly create a video on this myself, but let the cat out of the bag here. And it's not a secret. I've talked about it before, and those that have taken my advanced course have gone through this exercise. But you take 5 sake, and you put them on a coaster, and you write the number on the bottom of the coaster, and you put the exact same amount of sake in each one of these 5 sake. And you give yourself about 6 minutes, and you blind taste them. And you take notes. Then you mix them up. And because the number is on the coaster facing down, you don't know what happens after you mix them up, right? Then you taste them again, and you say, okay, this time the position number 1 was actually number 3 before. I can tell by the flavors and aromas. What you'll learn to do is you'll learn to remember what you've tasted and smelled. It's an extremely beneficial exercise. In doing that, you'll be able to nail flavor profiles. In tests like that, if you can give a reason why you think it is what it is, even if you're wrong, very often they say, yeah, you're right. And your perception is right, even if you've actually made a mistake in the final result. So perception and reproducibility is what they're looking at very often. So the exercise is an extremely beneficial exercise. It's a hassle. It takes dedication, it takes commitment, it takes practice. But you're probably experienced with that in terms of your beer tasting and your wine tasting. So to sum it up, always take notes, taste as wide a range as possible of sake that you can, and do blind tasting exercises with yourself. It doesn't have to be 5, it could be 3. It could be really similar sake, it could be completely different sake. As you practice, you will refine your palate for sure.
That's good advice.
That's awesome, John. Thank you. I know recently Tamiko and her team, Evans, gave us a sake, and they gave us a sake, in their opinion, I think it was Tozai, but they wanted something that checked the boxes kind of in the medium range. You know, in wine, we're always going to this medium plus acid, medium minus. But sake, I think acidity, for example, is a little more narrow, right? It's generally more medium.
Sake, really, yeah.
Yeah, but it's definitely a good benchmark. And then I really appreciate your advice. I think for all of us that are trying to get into it and get more serious, and Tamiko mentioned earlier, we're all learning. The more you get into learning, you realize how much you don't know. And of course, there's a follow-up, right? You're going to forget some of it if you don't use it in your everyday practice, but it's such an exciting time, especially since we all have so much time now to engage, interact with each other, and just learn and learn and learn. So yeah, thanks so much for sharing all that info. Real quick question, Monica, you guys have some crazy brand names, and I was just wondering, like, I'm a big fan of Bushido. I like that package, Way of the Warrior. But where do these names come from? It's definitely not like the traditional stuffiness of wine. Maybe it's more like beer where they get creative with names. But if you could give a little background to the tradition of naming names.
Yeah, totally. Sometimes it's a lot easier than others. For example, the Futsusu, Moon on the Water, that's the literal translation pretty much of the brand name in Japanese. Some of them we really have to think about the story and think about how to capture the essence of the sake and the story behind it, or maybe a little more of the character of the brewer in a name. Sometimes we have other people who have named our sakes for us, like Cowboy Yamahai, which was named by Bo Timkin of True Sake. We've been, sometimes people make fun of our names. They sounds like someone having a midlife crisis bought a yacht and named it like Dreamy Clouds or something, or but to John's point of how he started talking about his history with sake, it really is important to have an English name that has some sort of resonance with people, because even though Japanese is fairly phonetic and you can sound it out, those are long words with a lot of syllables that don't mean anything to people who don't speak Japanese. And so to say that you had a bottle of Yoshinogawa, that is just never going to stick with you unless you have an English name. So we're really, really sensitive to not make what we call like critter sakes or critter wines. Like we would never have a bottle of sake that said, that was called blushing geisha, or something that was just such an so obviously thought of by someone who's not Japanese. We really try to come up with names that make sense with the sake and either reflect the ethos of the producer or are more of a direct translation of the brand name.
So before I interrupt you there, John, so give you an example, Divine Droplets, Ginja Shizuka, right? Ginja Shizuka, to me, if I was just a guy coming off the street reading a menu, that means zero whatsoever. But Divine Droplets, that sounds amazing. That sounds like an expensive, maybe Jumai Daiginjo or Daiginjo. But yeah, it's a great relation to the American consumer for sure. John, what do you have to add?
When we got started, we meaning my company in Japan got started with Vine Connections back in, I think it was 99 or 98. In any event, so I sat down with Nick and Ed, the partners in Vine Connections, and like, okay, what's the sake called? It's like, it's Fukucho Suigetsu Junmai Ginjo. And they're like, dude, no. And that's how it all started. Like, no one is going to remember all that. We need an English nickname now. And I was initially against them. Like, that's just going to thin out the significance of the whole product, the whole thing. And then, so we started with, as Monica's pointed out, sometimes it's a direct translation. Like, Suigetsu is moon on the water. And so that worked perfectly. Other times, the direct translations don't work so well. So we've kind of had to be creative over the years. And that's how the whole thing got started. There was another point I was going to say, and I'm assuming you're going to edit this in time. But as we've gone on, we've got more and more creative. No? Well, stuck with that then. We've gotten more and more creative with the terms. And what we'll do, we being Sake Connections, the exporter side, we'll say, okay, these are what the characters mean. This is the history of the brewery. Pass it on to Vine Connections, and they'll put it through their creative engine and say, okay, cool, this will work. This is a name that everybody's it's gonna stick in their mind, and everybody will love it. So it's kind of a cooperation thing, but it all started because, exactly as Monica pointed out, nobody is gonna remember the Japanese if they don't have to. The last thing I'd say is initially I was against it, but then you go out in the field and you heard everybody using English names. You're like, okay. Obviously, they were right on that one. So.
It worked out. Hey, on a more fun note, I would like to ask everyone, what are they drinking when they're not drinking sake? So Tamiko, you and I have shared maybe 1 or 2 or 5 for nets in our life, you know, and battled over some wicked ping pong, which you were
Oh,
a
yeah.
master of. Tamiko kicks my butt every time. But you know, what else? What are your passions outside of sake in our beverage industry? What do you like doing on your off time, Tamiko?
Oh, boy. I say anything over 4% alcohol, does that put me to a very different category? Sorry. I enjoy, I mean, boy, Monica and I sometimes go out, we go have cocktails, we certainly have wine sometimes. Johnstown, we have drunk beer many times, many times. Yeah, I mean, yes, so I mean, within mine, my passion is champagne for sure, bubbly's. Franciacorta is my latest thing, but I love champagne, period. The spirits wise, I love rum, and then probably tequila mezcal next, and then gin in that order. Oh, let's not forget whiskey. Oh, see, that's how I narrow it
That's like
down.
20 on the list right there, Tommy.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Right.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Tamiko. Monica, do you have any favorites out there?
Yeah, very much so. My wine taste, I mean, I like a lot of wines, but my boyfriend says I'm pretty predictable when it comes to looking at a wine list. I drink a lot of Cru Beaujolais. I drink a lot of Chablis and Muscadet. Spirits wise, like John, I like gin quite a bit, and tequila. And yeah, those are my favorites.
Thank you. So it sounds like there's a theme here. Everyone likes something that's aromatic and full of flavor. I'm not hearing a bunch of vodka soda answers. Yeah, they're legitimate, authentic, you know, spirits that come from, or beers, of course, they come from a source, whether it's an agave or a plant or the juniper berries that get incorporated, the citrus. So yeah, it seems like that's a trend in our industry. If you drink with purpose. You drink because you want the full flavor. You want something that's exciting, and it's not about the alcohol. It's about an experience for sure. John, you have anything to share on that?
Just pretty much I'm a beer guy. I drink basically just sake and beer. Sometimes wine, sometimes martinis with gin. But I haven't gone for the licensing in beer, but I definitely know my beer well, and I love it very much. However, I tend towards pilsners. I'm not an IPA guy. My favorite beer in the world is Pilsner Quell, and that tells you a lot about me right there.
That's funny. So I'll bring up a little side joke. Cliff is obviously British, and he's always looking for a cleansing ale. And I had to dispute that. I said ales are the opposite of cleansing. It's cleansing lager. You know, most lagers, which are bottom fermented ales, or top fermented in terms of temperature and yeast, etc. But ales are fully aromatic and flavorful, whereas lagers, for the most part, are very crisp. But Cliff does have Bass Ale, which was the first pale ale out there, I think 1600s or so. But Bass Ale is the opposite of what we think of these days as a normal ale. So, Cliff.
So, yeah.
Shots are fired. It's fine.
No, that's all right. No, cleansing ale is yeah, it's a pilsner or a Kolsch, but usually a pilsner for me. And what that is when you've been drinking, you know, you started with cocktails, you've had some wine and a few other things. You need a cleansing ale so you can start drinking again. That's pretty much it.
I thought it was just an excuse for one more, no matter how late it is. Cleansing ale.
Oh gosh. Well, with that, I'd like everyone to kind of starting with you, Monica, and then Tamiko and John. Give your ways for people to contact you via social media, website, and again, just to thank you guys for coming on and talking with us today. I mean, the world of sake there's just so much. And John, you just blew my mind, and the 40 minutes of us talking even more than my mind already gets blown when Tamiko and Monica talk. So I really appreciate you guys coming on and talking to us. So Monica, you want to sign off and give us your how we can talk to you later?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. My social media, my Twitter is Monica A. Samuel. So MONICA ASAMUELS. I'm also on Instagram at msamuels1212. You can also email me at monica@vineconnections.com. And I look forward to hearing from you guys.
Tamiko, are you out again?
Yes. Yes, I can be reached on either Instagram, Facebook. I have 2 accounts. Both are Tamiko Ishidate. It's my first name and last name. It's very simple. Well, simple to maybe Japanese ears. Tamiko, T-A-M-I. I need English name, John. Can you name me English name?
You need one or you have one? Tammy? I don't know. Tammy?
Tammy. Anyways, Tamiko, last name is
Stick with that.
Ishidate. Those are both for Instagram and then Facebook. My email address is same at youngsmarket.com. Hope to hear from you.
Perfect.
And John,
Yeah, I have a website, sakeworld.com, sake-world.com. On Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, I'm John Guantner. I do publish a free newsletter from sakeworld.com, and I've been doing it for 20 years, actually. And all of them are archived there. So you can check that out if you're interested. Furthermore, I do publish a not-so-free newsletter. It's $80 a year, comes out twice a month. It's called the Sake Industry News, and I started last October. And it's basically focused on people that are selling sake in the United States, and it covers somewhat advanced topics in sake and a lot of news from the Japanese sake industry. That comes out twice a month. So if you're interested, you can check that out as well.
Perfect. Well, again, thank you, everyone. My name's Mitchell. We've got Misha and Cliff on. We're the Insomniacs. Look for this video to be posted on YouTube as well as our Instagram, Facebook. Thank you guys again, and cheers, everybody.
Kanpai.
Kanpai at the end. Kanpai.
Kanpai.
Kanpai.